90 minutes. That is how close Ottawa came to eating a 50% tariff on $20 billion of its own exports. Not a threat on paper, not a talking point on cable news, a real deadline sitting on the desk of the President of the United States, with the clock ticking down past midnight on August 19th, 2026. And then, less than 2 hours before it hit, Donald Trump picked up his phone and posted on Truth Social that he was pausing it. 3 days, that's it. 3 days to either lock in a deal that had been fought over for more than a year, or watch tariffs slam into dairy, electronics, furniture, lumber, beer, cement, and even hockey sticks coming out of Canada. This is the story of how we got to that 90-minute window, why Canada spent over a year refusing to sign what it called a bad deal, and how, in the space of about 48 hours, the entire shape of the agreement flipped. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back to February of 2025, when this fight didn't even really look like a fight yet. It looked like an opening move. The United States, under the new Trump administration, began imposing blanket tariffs on Canadian goods. Steel and aluminum were hit with 50% duties. Cars and trucks not built on American soil were hit with 25% tariffs. Canada, for its part, did not sit still. Ottawa fired back with retaliatory tariffs of its own, matching the American pressure dollar for dollar on a long list of goods. According to Wikipedia's ongoing tracking of the dispute, cross-referenced with contemporaneous wire reporting, this back and forth marked the beginning of what would become a defining trade standoff of Trump's second term, one that dragged in steel mills in Hamilton, aluminum smelters in Quebec, auto plants in Ontario, and dairy farms on both sides of the 49th parallel. For most of 2025, the story was one of gradual, grinding negotiation punctuated by deadlines that kept sliding. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had taken over from Justin Trudeau in March of that year, began walking back some of its own retaliatory tariffs starting in August 2025, according to trade law firm Blake's detailed public timeline of the dispute. That timeline shows a pattern that would repeat again and again over the following year. Temporary remissions, extensions, carve-outs for automobiles and aerospace parts, and a slow drip of concessions designed to keep supply chains breathing while the two governments hammered out something more permanent. It was messy, it was incremental, and underneath all of it, the core disagreement never actually went away. That disagreement crystallized in the summer of 2025, when Trump gave Canada a hard deadline of August 1st to reach an agreement or face a 35% tariff on goods that weren't compliant with the existing North American trade agreement. That's when Mark Carney, standing in Huntsville, Ontario, at a summit of Canada's provincial premiers, said the sentence that would define his approach to Trump for the next year. Speaking in French, as reported by CBC News and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's ongoing coverage, Carney said, "The government of Canada will not accept a bad deal." He went further, telling reporters that Canada's objective was not to reach an agreement, whatever it costs, but instead to pursue something that was genuinely in the best interest of Canadians. It was a line he would repeat, almost word for the next 13 months, and he meant it. When the August 1st deadline arrived, no deal materialized. According to BBC reporting from that period, Trump himself told reporters ahead of a trip to Scotland that he did not expect to reach an agreement with Canada, saying, "We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada," and suggesting their relationship might simply settle into a tariff, not really a negotiation. That's a striking admission from the American side. It wasn't spin. It wasn't a Canadian official trying to look tough for a domestic audience. That was the President of the United States on the record, saying the talks had essentially stalled. Carney's response, according to the same reporting, was to double down, insisting Canada would not rush into an agreement it didn't believe in. Here's where the story gets interesting and where most casual observers lost the thread, because no deal didn't mean no consequences. Trump had already layered a blanket 25% tariff on certain Canadian goods, on top of the 50% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, on top of the 25% tariff on cars and trucks not assembled in the United States. Those tariffs stayed in place through the fall and winter of 2025 into 2026, grinding on Canadian exporters while both governments postured in public and negotiated quietly in private. Canada's own retaliatory measures went through a similarly complicated evolution. According to the Blake's legal timeline, remission periods for Canadian tariffs on American steel used in manufacturing were set to expire, then extended, then narrowed, with steel used in automobile and aerospace production carved out separately from steel used in general manufacturing. If that sounds complicated, that's because it was. Trade lawyers were tracking expiry dates the way sports fans track playoff brackets. By February 2026, the picture shifted again. U.S. Customs and Border Protection stopped collecting a 35% tariff under a specific American Emergency Power Statute on goods that weren't compliant with the existing North American trade agreement, replacing it with a new global 10% tariff that applied to non-compliant goods from many countries, Canada included. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses' tracking of the dispute, goods that were compliant with the existing North American trade framework remained exempt from that particular tariff, while non-compliant goods dropped from paying 35% down to 10%. But, and this is a crucial detail, tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, some automotive parts, lumber, and other wood products remained in place under a completely separate set of American trade rules, the kind used to protect national security-sensitive industries. In other words, one tariff regime eased while another stayed locked in place. This is the texture of the dispute that a lot of headline coverage missed. It was never one single tariff. It was a stack of overlapping tariffs, each with its own legal basis, its own expiry date, and its own political constituency fighting to keep it or kill it. Throughout all of this, Ottawa kept insisting it would not be rushed, and that stance was tested again and again over the following months as trade officials from both countries shuttled between Washington and the Canadian capital, trying to find language both sides could live with. Then came August 2026, and the pressure ratcheted up to a level the relationship hadn't seen before. Trump and his trade officials laid out a new deadline: reach a deal or face 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian products, effective August 19th. This wasn't a symbolic list. According to CFIB's detailed breakdown of the announcement, the list covered dairy products including milk, cream, and whey, a bizarrely named motor vehicles category that, despite the name, contained no actual cars, instead covering electronics and telecom equipment, furniture and home goods, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics and packaging, clothing, footwear, luggage, toys, sporting goods, machinery, cosmetics, and agricultural products like flowers, plants, and seeds. That's not a narrow trade irritant. That's a tariff designed to touch nearly every corner of the Canadian export economy at once, hitting well over a dozen distinct industries in a single stroke. Canadian trade officials didn't sit back and wait for the deadline to arrive. According to Bloomberg's reporting from mid-August, Canada U, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, spent days camped out in Washington, meeting repeatedly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. A spokesperson for LeBlanc described one Sunday meeting, a virtual session lasting about an hour, as constructive, saying the two negotiating teams had taken stock of the work that has been done and that discussions were continuing. That's diplomatic language for, we are not there yet, but we are still talking. Meanwhile, back home, the political pressure on Carney was intense and layered. This wasn't just Carney versus Trump. It was Carney trying to hold together a coalition of premiers, each with their own regional stakes in the outcome. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, representing Canada's manufacturing heartland, made clear that any deal had to include real relief on steel and autos, telling reporters, according to reporting from the trade publication Transport Topics, "We want a fair deal for Ontario. We want a fair deal for Canadians. And we negotiate through strength, not weakness." When asked whether a lowered tariff on autos alone would count as fair, Ford's answer was blunt. Every single tariff had to be matched. Tariff for tariff. British Columbia had a completely different priority. Premier David Eby's focus was softwood lumber, a decades-old sore point in the relationship that predates Trump entirely. According to that same reporting, it appeared increasingly likely that lumber wouldn't even be part of the initial deal at all. The forestry sector had become a genuine sticking point in the talks, with 4 separate sources telling the Globe and Mail that the United States had pushed to either exclude forestry from the negotiations entirely or hive it off into a completely separate set of talks down the line. For an industry that stretches from British Columbia's interior through northern Ontario and into Quebec, that's not a small detail. That's a signal that even a done deal wasn't going to resolve everything at once. So here's where the story sat. Just days before the deadline, Canada, led by Carney, had spent more than a year publicly and repeatedly rejecting the idea of signing a rushed, unfavorable agreement. Trump had, at points, openly said he wasn't sure a deal would even happen. Premiers were divided on what an acceptable deal even looked like, and the clock was running out on a 50% tariff that would hit dairy farmers, furniture makers, lumber mills, and electronics importers all at once. Then, in the space of about 2 days, everything moved. According to the Globe and Mail's reporting published August 16th and updated August 17th, the outlines of a prospective agreement had finally taken shape, after what the paper described as a month of frenetic negotiations. Under the emerging terms, Trump would lower his tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products. In exchange, Canada would concede ground on a long list of American demands touching alcohol, dairy, and government procurement. The same reporting laid out specific numbers that had been floated. Steel and aluminum, then sitting at 50% tariffs, would move to a tariff rate quota system, with steel facing somewhere between 10 and 15% within the quota, and aluminum facing a single-digit tariff within its quota, while both metals would face much higher tariffs on anything above that threshold. That's a fundamentally different structure than a flat 50% tariff. It's a system that rewards staying within negotiated volume limits and punishes exceeding them, which gives both governments a lever to manage the relationship going forward rather than a blunt on-off switch. Then came the night of August 18th. According to CTV's live coverage out of the Canadian capital, Trump posted on Truth Social less than 2 hours before the midnight deadline, announcing he was suspending the new 50% tariffs for 3 days based on a pending trade deal. Carney's own statement that night struck a more cautious tone than Trump's. The Prime Minister said the two countries had made substantial progress, but added that there is important work still to be done. That's not the language of a leader popping champagne. That's the language of someone who has been burned by premature declarations of victory before and wasn't going to make that mistake in public, even with a deal apparently close. $20 billion. That's the scale of what was riding on those 3 extra days. According to CTV's reporting, the tariffs that would have applied covered cement and hockey sticks alongside the dairy, electronics, and furniture already mentioned. Ottawa doesn't often find itself negotiating over hockey sticks as a matter of national economic policy, but 2026 made that a very real line item in a trade dispute between two of the largest trading partners on the planet. Then, on August 19th, the deal, or at least the outline of one, actually landed. According to the Associated Press, writing from Washington, Canada, and the United States moved closer that Wednesday to finalizing an agreement that would avert the threatened 50% tariffs entirely. Trump told reporters at the White House that the talks with Canada had produced what he called a very fair deal for both sides. Speaking to Al Jazeera and Reuters, Trump went further, claiming the new arrangement would mean no tariffs going into Canada for American exporters, and that tariffs would be non-existent for farmers. His exact words, according to Al Jazeera's report, were that American farmers had been paying tremendous tariffs into Canada, and those tariffs are going to be totally eviscerated, down to zero. That is a dramatic claim, and it deserves scrutiny because it runs directly into one of the most sensitive parts of the entire Canadian trade relationship: supply management. Canada operates a system that allows a set quota of dairy imports at low tariffs, and once that quota is exceeded, much higher tariffs kick in automatically. The United States has argued for years that this system unfairly blocks American dairy producers from full access to the Canadian market. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most politically untouchable pieces of Canadian agricultural policy, defended fiercely by dairy farmers in Quebec and Ontario in particular. So, when Dominic LeBlanc spoke to reporters in Washington that same day, according to the Washington Times, his language was notably different from Trump's. LeBlanc said Canada's agriculture sector will be well protected, and that Canada had maintained our tough line. Two governments announcing the same deal on the same day, using visibly different language about what had actually been agreed on dairy. That gap matters, and it's exactly the kind of detail that gets lost if you only watch the headline sound bites. On the tariff numbers themselves, the reporting from multiple outlets converged, though not perfectly. Bloomberg reported that the Trump administration was poised to cut auto tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles from 25% down to 15%, citing people familiar with the matter. On steel and aluminum, CBC News reported that a source with knowledge of the forthcoming agreement said tariffs were being lowered from 50% to 25%, while a separate Bloomberg report the same day described tariffs dropping to a similar 25% range, describing it as roughly halving the existing duty. BNN Bloomberg's coverage added that multiple outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, had reported the steel and aluminum duties would fall from the current 50% levels, though a source speaking to the Canadian press cautioned that while lower duties on steel and aluminum were confirmed to be part of the deal, the exact new tariff rate could not yet be confirmed publicly. That's an important caveat, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Even as both governments were standing in front of cameras calling this a done deal, the specific numbers were still being triangulated by reporters talking to sources who weren't authorized to speak on the record. This was a real, substantive agreement, but as of the moment this reporting was published, it was not yet a fully public, fully finalized legal text. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, appearing alongside LeBlanc in Washington, struck an optimistic tone, saying he felt confident the agreement would protect American workers and jobs, while strengthening what he called the North American market, positioning the continent as what he described as a manufacturing and energy powerhouse. LeBlanc, for his part, smiled beside Greer during the Wednesday press appearance, according to BNN Bloomberg's description of the scene, before returning to the Canadian capital to meet with Carney and finalize Canada's side of the agreement. Greer said he intended to brief members of Congress and American stakeholders on the substance of what the two sides had negotiated. So, what actually flipped, and why does the framing of rejected, then flipped, hold up under scrutiny? Here's the honest answer, laid out plainly. Canada did not reject a single, final, take it or leave it American offer in one dramatic moment, and then reverse course days later. That is not what the verified reporting shows. What actually happened, according to the sourcing above, is more accurate and, frankly, more interesting. For more than a year, Ottawa consistently refused to sign on to deal terms it judged unfavorable, repeating the phrase, "will not accept a bad deal," across multiple deadlines, multiple summits, and multiple rounds of tariff escalation, even when that refusal meant living under sustained 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum and 25% tariffs on autos for well over a year. Then, in the space of roughly 48 hours in mid-August 2026, that standoff produced a structurally different outcome than what had been on the table just weeks earlier. Tariff rate quotas instead of flat rates, auto tariffs cut nearly in half, steel and aluminum tariffs cut roughly in half, and a paused 50% tariff threat on $20 billion of goods that never actually took effect. That is the flip. Not a single rejected term reversing overnight, but a year-long refusal to blink, finally producing a materially better set of numbers than what Canada would have accepted at the start of the year, or what it was staring down just days before the deadline. It's also worth being honest about what remains unresolved, because a responsible account of this story can't pretend the deal is a finished, signed, sealed document. As of this reporting, the Associated Press and Washington Post both explicitly noted that key terms of the agreement remained unclear even as Trump announced it publicly. The Globe and Mail's reporting from just days earlier flagged forestry and softwood lumber as a genuine unresolved sticking point, with sources indicating the U.S. wanted it excluded from the main deal or pushed into separate talks entirely. British Columbia's premier had signaled that outcome was increasingly likely even before the final announcement. That means one of Canada's oldest and most contentious trade disputes with the United States may not actually be settled by this agreement at all. It may simply be deferred to a future round of talks under a future deadline with its own future drama. There's also the matter of verification versus announcement. Trump's claim that tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports into the U.S. would go down to zero is, as of this reporting, Trump's own characterization made to reporters at the White House. LeBlanc's more measured description of a well-protected agriculture sector and a tough line maintained by Canada is not a flat contradiction of Trump's statement, but it is a noticeably different emphasis. And neither government had, at the time of this reporting, published the full legal text of the Agreement for Independent Verification. Journalists at multiple major outlets, including the Canadian press, explicitly noted they could confirm that lower steel and aluminum tariffs were part of the deal, but could not yet confirm the precise rate. That is the state of verified knowledge as this script was written, a real, substantive, multi-part agreement publicly announced by both governments, with several major numbers still awaiting final confirmation. Zoom out for a second, because there's a broader pattern here worth naming. This dispute, stretching from February 2025 to August 2026, is a case study in how modern trade negotiations between close allies actually function under pressure. It wasn't one clean negotiation with one outcome. It was a rolling sequence of tariffs, retaliations, remissions, extensions, deadline threats, deadline pauses, and finally a framework agreement that itself contains unresolved pieces. Ottawa's strategy throughout was patience under pressure. Absorb the tariffs, keep talking, keep saying no to bad terms, and wait for economic and political reality to shift the negotiating dynamic. Washington's strategy was escalation as leverage, raise the stakes with deadlines and tariff threats, then use the threat of economic pain to extract concessions on procurement, alcohol, and dairy access. Both approaches produced real costs along the way. Canadian steel and aluminum producers operated for well over a year under 50% tariffs. American consumers and companies buying Canadian lumber, cement, and electronics faced the prospect of a sudden 50% price shock that could have hit just before the deadline passed. Neither side got everything it wanted, and depending on how the final legal text reads once it's published in full, that could still shift further in the weeks ahead. For manufacturers, on the Canadian side, particularly in Ontario's auto sector, a cut from 25% to 15% on vehicle tariffs is a meaningful bottom-line difference, even if it's not full removal. For steel and aluminum producers, moving from a flat 50% tariff to a tariff rate quota system with lower duties. Inside the quota gives exporters more predictability, provided the quota levels are set high enough to accommodate existing trade volumes, a detail that, again, was not fully public at the time of this reporting. For dairy farmers watching from Quebec and rural Ontario, the gap between Trump's down to zero framing and LeBlanc's well-protected framing is the single most important open question left in this entire saga, because it goes to the heart of a system Canadian governments of every political stripe have defended for decades. There's another layer to this story that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it involves what Canada was doing at home while all this external pressure was building. According to the legal analysis published by the firm McCarthy-Tétrault, Carney's government didn't just play defense on tariffs, it moved aggressively on industrial policy at the same time. Canada introduced a Buy Canadian procurement approach that required steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber sourced domestically for government contracts above $250,000 in value. Ottawa also rolled out an additional $500 million in liquidity support through what's called the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility, aimed specifically at lumber producers who were sitting on funds tied up in American duties, bonds, and security deposits for years at a time. On top of that, Carney's government moved to tighten its own trade defenses against a completely different country, China. According to Global News reporting from mid-2025, Canada changed its tariff rate quota structure for steel imports from countries without a free trade agreement, cutting the allowable quota from 100% down to 50% of 2024 import volumes, and layering an additional 25% duty on steel from any country found to contain metal melted and poured in China. That's a critical piece of context because it shows Ottawa wasn't simply playing a reactive defensive game against Washington. It was simultaneously trying to prove to the United States that Canada takes concerns about Chinese steel transshipments seriously, which was itself one of the American negotiating team's long-standing complaints about the North American steel market broadly. It's also worth noting that this wasn't purely a bilateral closed-door process. Carney and Trump appeared together publicly during this stretch, including at a working luncheon during the G7 summit held in Évian-les-Bains, France, in June of 2026, according to the Globe and Mail's photo documentation of the talks. Diplomatic summits like that one matter in negotiations like these, because they give both leaders a chance to signal tone and intent to their own domestic audiences without committing to specific numbers on the record. The fact that Carney and Trump were photographed together, cordial and working, just 2 months before the tensest phase of this entire standoff, tells you something about how these negotiations actually work in practice. Public friction and private cooperation running on two separate tracks at the same time, right up until the final deal comes together. There's a reason this kind of story deserves more than a headline glance, and it's exactly this level of detail. The quota structures, the carve-outs, the gap between what officials say in front of cameras and what the actual legal text ends up saying. That's the kind of granular tracking this channel focuses on, because trade deals like this one rarely get resolved in a single announcement. They get resolved in the fine print that comes weeks later. And if you want to actually understand how this settles once the full text is published, staying subscribed is the way to catch that follow-up the moment it's confirmed. Let's also talk about timing, because timing tells you almost as much as the substance does. The deadline that triggered this final sprint was August 19th. The pause came less than 2 hours before it hit, on the night of August 18th. The announcement of a broad agreement came the very next day. That is not the pacing of a negotiation that concluded on its own internal logic. That is the pacing of a negotiation that concluded because a hard deadline forced both sides to either finalize what they'd been circling for weeks or accept the economic damage of the alternative. Deadlines in trade diplomacy are not just calendar markers. They're leverage devices deployed deliberately to force movement. Trump used deadlines repeatedly throughout this dispute. The August 1st threat of 35% tariffs, the August 19th threat of 50% tariffs, and both times, movement came in the final hours, not before. It's worth pointing out how unusual it is for a close, decades-long trading partner and security ally to end up on the receiving end of 50% tariffs, paused with less than 2 hours to spare, not once, but as the culmination of a pattern that had been building since early 2025. Canada and the United States share the longest border in the world, an integrated auto manufacturing supply chain that literally crosses back and forth across that border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished, and a security relationship that predates NATO. That backdrop makes the scale of this dispute even more striking. This wasn't a minor trading partner getting squeezed. This was arguably the closest economic relationship the United States has anywhere on the planet, pushed to the brink of a 50% tariff wall on $20 billion of goods over things like hockey sticks and cement. So where does that leave things as of this reporting? A framework deal exists, publicly announced by senior officials on both sides in Washington on August 19, 2026. It includes lower tariffs on autos, moving from 25 to 15% according to Bloomberg's sourcing. It includes lower tariffs on steel and aluminum, moving from 50% toward a range reported as roughly 25%, structured through tariff rate quotas, according to the Globe and Mail's earlier reporting on the emerging framework. It includes a claim from the American side that agricultural tariffs into Canada would effectively disappear, paired with a more cautious Canadian description of a protected agriculture sector. And it leaves forestry and softwood lumber one of the oldest fault lines in the entire relationship, as an open question that may not be resolved in this round at all. If you've been tracking this dispute since it began in February of 2025, you've watched Ottawa hold a consistent line through more than a year of escalating tariffs, and you've now watched that line produce a materially different deal than what was on the table even a few weeks earlier. Whether that counts as a full vindication of Canada's strategy, or simply the least bad outcome available under sustained pressure, is genuinely up for debate, and reasonable people on both sides of the border are already arguing about exactly that. Before wrapping up, here's a plain accounting of where this information came from and where the honest gaps still are. The historical timeline of tariffs, remissions, and retaliatory measures draws on the Blake's Law Firm's published timeline of the dispute and the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses' ongoing tracker. Carney's public statements and the will not accept a bad deal line are drawn from CBC News, CTV News, and CP24's direct coverage of the July 2025 Premier's Summit in Huntsville, Ontario. Trump's comments about the odds of reaching a deal are drawn from BBC, reporting from July 2025. The final sprint toward the August 19th, 2026 deadline, including the 3-day pause, is drawn from CTV News, Bloomberg, and the Associated Press. The specific tariff figures, the cut in auto tariffs to 15%, and the reduction in steel and aluminum tariffs, are drawn from Bloomberg and CBC News, reporting citing people familiar with the matter, and it should be stated plainly that, as of this reporting, those exact figures had not yet been confirmed through an officially published legal text by either government. Trump's down to zero claim on agricultural tariffs and LeBlanc's well-protected description of Canada's agriculture sector are both drawn directly from their own on-the-record remarks, reported by Al Jazeera and the Washington Times respectively, and the difference in emphasis between those two statements remains unresolved and worth watching closely. The status of softwood lumber and forestry tariffs as an unresolved sticking point comes from the Globe and Mail's reporting, citing 4 separate sources familiar with the talks. That's the full sourced picture as it stands right now. Reasonable people can look at these same facts and land in very different places. Some will see a year of Canadian patience finally paying off in real, measurable tariff reductions. Others will point out that a deal announced in front of cameras, with the exact numbers still being pieced together by reporters after the fact, isn't the same thing as a finished agreement, and that the hardest issue, softwood lumber, may have simply been kicked down the road rather than resolved. Both of those readings are defensible based on what's actually been verified so far. So here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. Did Canada's year of saying no actually produce a better outcome than accepting an earlier and less favorable deal would have? Or did the drawn-out standoff simply cost Canadian industries a year of 50% tariffs for a result that, once the full legal text is published, may end up looking more modest than the initial announcement suggests? That's genuinely not settled yet, and it won't be until the complete terms are public. If you want to see how this actually resolves once the fine print on steel quotas, dairy access, and softwood lumber gets published, that follow-up is exactly the kind of update worth having land in your feed automatically rather than trying to track down after the fact. Subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss it. And if this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown of how trade disputes actually get negotiated is useful to you, there's a lot more of this kind of tracking ahead as the rest of this deal's terms come out, so it's worth staying subscribed for that. One more thing worth saying plainly, stories like this rarely end at the press conference. The real substance tends to show up weeks later in the fine print, and subscribing now means you'll see that follow-up the moment it's confirmed, rather than piecing it together after the fact. What do you think? Did Ottawa play this exactly right by refusing to blink for over a year, or did the drawn-out standoff cost Canadian industries more than a faster deal would have?